Hello again, and welcome to the second episode of All Your Basics. If you missed the first one, this is a series for new players or anyone else who wants to get deeper into deck building and playing with your deck's plan in mind. And I'm going to walk you through the construction of a deck that I've built for this episode. Normally something that's quite budget friendly, so you can get building it right away even if you've only been playing for a week or two. And then I'll jump onto the ladder and play a couple of games with it and see how we do. I apologise if I'm a bit sort of worn down today. I'm slightly ill. My throat's a bit sore. Hopefully that doesn't really come across too badly. A couple of people also pointed out after the last one that the sound quality is not great. I can only apologise for that. I've got a 30 quid headset that I bought from like a Curry's or something. At some point I would like to get a decent microphone, but I don't think they're very cheap. So watch this space on that one. In the meantime, I hope that, I don't sound too terrible. Anyway, enough of that. Today I'm going to build what we call a tempo deck. So tempo is a very complicated concept in collectible card games, and a lot of people much better at them than I have tried and failed to come up with a consensus definition. Roughly what it means is time. Generally the player with the initiative has a tempo advantage. So if I've got 2 minions on the board and you've got none, I'm ahead in some way. Even if you've got lots of cards in your hand, I'm at least ahead in terms of playing proactively on the board. I will have minions that can attack before you do, assuming you don't have some kind of rush minion or removal. And I'll be able to, say, attack your face or make favourable trades at my decision. I get to pick how the trades work out when our minions are crashing into each other and trading off. So again, just to recap, if you missed the first episode, trading is what we generally call if 2 minions attack each other and they both die, they've traded. I've spent a card and you've spent a card, and the cards have both gone away and we've traded 1 for 1, as it's called. If I play a minion and you play a removal spell on it, you play a martyrdom or a dark transformation, you've traded your removal spell for my minion. That's also a trade. A lot of the time in Duelist you're trying to set up these favourable attacks where you trade a worse minion for your opponent's better minion, or you use your better minion to completely destroy their smaller minion and have a damaged larger minion left over. So for instance, I might use a 3/6 Primus Shieldmaster to eat a 2/3 Healing Mystic, and I still have a 3/4 left, and I've gained advantage. When you're ahead on tempo, going back to that, you get the opportunity to make those favourable exchanges more often. You generally have a bit more control over the flow of the game. Normally because you're the player with larger board presence. In Duelist, often both players will have some minions out, but normally one person will be pressuring the other, they'll be making aggressive attacks, and the other player is trying to defend themselves and stay alive. And in those situations, we say that the player making the aggressive moves has the tempo advantage. The tempo is in their favour. If I in the same turn remove your 1 minion, say with a martyrdom, and play a minion of my own, I've swung the tempo. I've gained tempo advantage, or reclaimed some. Maybe you've got another larger minion out, but I've made some kind of gain in terms of tempo. And you can kind of extrapolate from that concept and build tempo decks. And these decks want to get ahead early and then stay ahead. And there's a few different ways to do that. In Magic the Gathering, tempo decks often play one threat early on. They'll play like a 3/2, which is slightly bigger in Magic than it is in Duelist, and harder to kill. And they'll attack with that while removing everything the opponent plays or countering their spells and protecting their one threat. And that's one way of doing it. In Hearthstone and Duelist, it tends to come from snowballing your board, so you have more and more minions while also interacting with your opponents, while removing their stuff, either by eating them with your own minions or using actual removal spells. So just to recap, tempo is hard to define, but roughly analogous to having the initiative in the game, having the option to make aggressive plays and pressure your opponent, being in the front of the race. So one of my favorite things about Duelist is golems. I love that in Duelist you can have minions that everybody starts with. They're mostly basic. They're not all basic. There's one common one and a couple of there's a rare and a legendary that support them, but most of them are common. And in a lot of games, the sort of basic creature that represents the approximate stats that you might expect for the amount of mana you pay, what we call vanilla creatures, because they don't have any abilities, often has several other similar creatures that are the same size that have extra text. So, for instance, if you've played Hearthstone, one of the game's kind of default creatures is called Chillwind Yeti. It's a 4/5 for 4. In Duelist, we have Hailstone Golem, who's the same thing, it's a 4/6 for 4. But in Hearthstone, there are other creatures that are 4/5s for 4 with extra abilities, like Mechanical Yeti. In Duelist, there aren't. The Hailstone Golem is actually special. It has more stats than any other 4 mana minion that doesn't have some sort of downside to make up for it. So, Primus Shieldmaster has Provoke, but is smaller. Suntide Maiden is smaller to make up for its self-healing ability. And then things like, even things like Earth Sister Taigete, who is this horribly powerful legendary that's currently seen on the ladder quite a lot, is also smaller than the Hailstone Golem. The Hailstone Golem still has an advantage over the other cards, despite being, basic. You start with it, it's still good. I really like that they did that in Duelist. From the very beginning of the game, you have access to these basic cards that aren't just outclassed later on. There is something special about them, which is that they have the biggest pile of stats that you can find. Which means that if you're playing a tempo deck, one thing you can do is, have lots of efficiently costed small minions and then powerful removal effects that will remove your opponent's creatures from the board and allow you to get ahead by snowballing lots of your threats and removing theirs. But these small minions, they can die quite easily. If your opponent has, say, a Plasma Storm, all your dudes go away, well, that's that. Maybe you've got a Phoenix Fire and another 3/3 in hand, and your opponent's now going to play a 6-drop, and you're not so happy. And it's also quite difficult to find large amounts of removal. But one thing you can do is just play golems. They're huge. Which means that, apart from the 0 to 3, maybe 6, depending on their faction, spells that your opponent might have that can actually efficiently remove a golem, your golems will outclass your opponent's minions all the time. Right? They're just larger. So your opponent might have a 6/6 for 6 legendary with a bunch of text on it, but you've got an 8/8. Doesn't have rules, but it will eat that 6/6 and survive. And the golems, because they don't have text, if you and your opponent are playing a lot of minions that just, if you're constantly removing each other's minions, right? If you're not expecting your minions to survive, the golems are a bit awkward. They don't generate value the turn they come in. Like we were talking last week, we built a Kara deck that had loads of minions with opening Gambit, which do generate value when they come in, and they were small. We have very large minions that don't do that. So if we can get ahead on board and stick a large minion, and our opponent can't really remove it, then we can use that minion to eat something and then play another one, and our opponent's in an even worse spot because then we've got one damaged big minion and another bigger fresh one, and maybe we can do the same thing next turn and so on. And the idea is just to outclass the opponent's minions and hope they don't draw too much of the hard removal that they need to interact with us. Making that even better, there's a card called Golem Metallurgist. Am I allowed to search from here? No, I have to pick a general. Well, I'll get to that. So there's a card called Golem Metallurgist, which we'll use. It's a rare. It's a 2/3 for 2, which is a good baseline, and it reduces the cost of golems, which allows you to make even bigger tempo plays by playing, say, the Metallurgist on turn 1, and then if it survives, you move it onto mana tile and play a 5 mana golem on turn 2. That's huge. You get a 4/9 on turn 2 on the play. That's ridiculous. So we're going to take advantage of that, and then pair that up with some of the best 2-drop minions in the game, which have the same sort of effect. They're very aggressive, they have lots of stats or hitting power for their cost, And obviously the best faction for all of that is Lionar. We're going to start with Argeon. Oh, here we are. Here's the Golem Metallurgist now that I've picked a general. So Argeon is great. I like Lionar. They have some good removal, which we'll see. They have a very cheap area of effect, Tempest, which can clear out swarms of Wraithlings and things. They have Martyrdom, which can just blow up anything, and we don't care that much about them gaining life when we have a lot of 8/8s and 10/10s in our deck. They have Divine Bond, which synergizes really well with giant creatures. And they also have some really good 2-drops that we can use to get our head on board early. And Argeon's Bloodborne spell, Roar, is wonderful for making those 2-drops go the extra distance. So I was talking earlier about tempo allowing you to trade up. If I play a Windblade Adept, right, which is a 4/3 when it's next to Argeon, and you play a Primus Shieldmaster, which is a 3/6, I can roar my Adept and trade them. My 6/3 will trade with your 3/6. And now I've gained a mana effectively in that exchange. I spent 3 mana to remove your 4 mana minion, and I probably have the ability to play something else in the same turn. So Roar is really good for pressuring the opponent, cheating by making our minions extra large. You know, later on when you're both just top decking, you're top decking 6/6s instead of 4/6s. And allowing us to make efficient trades, which furthers our deck's plan. So, obviously, if we're going to build a golem deck, the first thing we need is golems. So let's start there. So, as you can see, there aren't that many of them, and there are a couple that are a bit small. So these two, Skyrock Golem and Bloodshard Golem, are not generally very exciting. Skyrock dies to a general hit. There are far better 2-drops than him in the game, especially as we're playing the faction with arguably the best 2-drops. And Bloodshard Golem dies to quite a lot. It dies to a general hit plus a Wraithling, or a Blood Tear Alchemist ping, or it dies to Varth, the Magmar General, who's been powered up once. But also, we're playing Lionar. We have 4/3s for 2. Why do we need this guy? Golem Vanquisher, I only have one of this. I was sort of tempted to throw it in and suggest that, you know, if you don't have one, which is not unreasonable, it's legendary, replace it with something else. But I felt like that would be cheating. It also does mean that these die to Hollow Grove Keeper, which is not played that much at the moment, but that would be very sad. The rest of this stuff, though, so Hailstone Golem, Bright Moss Golem, Storm Metal Golem, and Dragonbone Golem, these are all the big piles of stats that I was talking about. And the Metallurgist is the glue that helps us make some really unfair plays very early on. So I had a test game earlier. I've tested this on ladder twice. I won both games, which I was not expecting. This deck is actually better than I thought it would be. And in the second game, I played turn 1 Metallurgist. It didn't die. Turn 2 Bright Moss Golem. Turn 3 move Argeon up, take another mana tile, and play the Storm Metal Golem. And I won on turn 5 by attacking for 26. It was absurd. So any card that lets us do stuff like that, we have to play it. So this is a rare, and we need 3 of them, which is a bit awkward when you're working on a tight budget. If you don't have these and you're unwilling to craft them, you can replace them with probably Primus Fists, and you won't be too far off. You lose some of your explosive start potential, but realistically, most of the time when you play this on turn 1, it will die anyway. Your opponent, if your opponent can remove it, they will. So, if you don't have it, don't feel like you can't play this deck at all. You're not losing out on too much, and the deck still functions without it. Like I said, Primus Fist is probably the best replacement, because that's really good in a tempo deck. It basically gives you extra temporary versions of Argeon's hero power. Sorry, Bloodborne spell. Oops. So, next up, Hailstone Golem. We want 3 of these. Solid beef. We can play it on turn 2 pretty easily, and it'll be great at fighting for the board early on. Bright Moss Golem, we can play it on turn 2 off a Golem Metallurgist, if we have him on a tile, or if we're going second, we can play it on turn 2. And this is really good with one of Lionar's signature spells, Divine Bond, which we'll see later, as well as being, you know, very big and respectable in its own right. And then these top end cards. These can be a little clunky. They are expensive, but there is really something to be said for just dropping a giant pile of stats that will chew through anything else your opponent plays. Like, there are not very many minions in this game that approach the size of Dragonbone Golem. So for that reason, we actually want to run a fair amount of them. So I'm going to put in 3 of the 6 mana Storm Metal Golem and 2 of the 7 mana one. If you want to add a third, I wouldn't fault you. Bear in mind that because we're running these minions that don't have text, they don't have opening gambits, they don't have death wishes, if you are falling behind on tempo, these don't do that much to help you catch up. They're just very good at keeping you ahead due to their giant pile of stats. So playing a large number of expensive cards without text can be a problem. On the other hand, they don't die to Dispel like a lot of cards do. You know, cards get neutered by Dispel quite easily. Or small removal things like Phoenix Fires don't get rid of them. And it's nice to have expensive minions, because if you don't have that many cards in your hand, you know, one expensive minion still takes your turn to play and is very impactful regardless of what the rest of your hand looks like. So we do want a good number of these because they fulfill the deck's core goal pretty well. Speaking of Divine Bond, you know, it goes really well with a bunch of large creatures. The thing that makes them larger. So Divine Bond is one of Lionar's premier kill cards, and you may have seen people complaining about it on Reddit already if you frequent the subreddit. It gives a minion plus attack equal to its health. It's normally used with a card called Ironcliff Guardian, which is a 3/10 with Provoke and Airdrop for 5 mana. Brightmoss Golem carries Divine Bond just as well. It doesn't have Airdrop or Provoke, but it does have the advantage of not dying to Plasma Storm and getting cheapened by Golem Metallurgist. It's also basic instead of rare, so it's a bit more budget friendly. If you're building this deck and you have Ironcliff Guardians, you want to put them in instead of Brightmoss Golems, I wouldn't blame you, but try Brightmoss out. It's surprisingly good. Anyway, so this Divine Bond was how I was able to do that ridiculous 26 damage in one turn I mentioned earlier. I dropped it on a Storm Metal Golem, that was 16 by itself, plus Roar, that's 18, and then, you know, this card is ridiculous. It is, however, a bit situational. It doesn't do that much in the early game, and playing it in the mid game can feel like a waste. So for that reason, I like to generally just run 2 of them. It does decrease your chances of the double Divine Bond insta-kill play, but I think those come up rarely enough that, you know, because if you've got 2 Divine Bonds in hand and 1 minion on the board, and your opponent kills it, well, that's you done. So I like to only run 2, just because it's more of a win condition rather than something you just always want to have access to. And when you're trying to set one up, if you draw it, you can just hold on to it instead of replacing it. Alright, so we've got our curve of golems, but it needs some fleshing out. We don't have a whole lot of stuff around the 2 and 3 mana slot. We don't have any card draw, we don't have any removal, and of course we have 23 slots to fill. So we are playing Lionar, and we need cheap cards. Well, we're in the best place for that. So Lionar have some of the most solid, wonderful 2-drops in the game. So the first one is Windblade Adept, which is basic. See him here. Windblade is great. It's essentially a 4/3 for 2. That's ridiculous. I mean, the 4/3 Golem is 3 mana, so you're cheating on mana for that. It does lose out if it moves away from Argeon, but that's not a huge downside. We want 3 of these. I also want to play 3 copies of Azeroth Lion. This is a common rather than a basic. So again, if you don't have them, replace them with Primus Fists. If you don't have either if you don't have either Lions or Golem Metallurgists, there's Healing Mystic. Plenty of good 2-drops in this game. So Azeroth Lion it has Celerity, which doesn't sound that powerful because the Lion is quite small, but it works really well with Argeon's Bloodborne spell, and it's very good at nipping mana orbs early on. So it can steal a mana orb and then retreat, or it can cross the field and steal the mana orb at the top, which always, you know, you can do to surprise people. It's just a very neat little card that does a surprising amount of work, so we'll want 3 of those. Next up, Silverguard Knight. This one is basic, so you'll have it. And it is a 3/5 with provoke for 3, provided it's next to Argeon, which again is really not a cost. This also carries a roar really well. Now you've got a 5/5 provoke for only 4. And there is a 5/5 provoke in the game. It's 5 mana normally. So you're just getting a fantastic deal with the Silverguard Knight. It's a little bit more vulnerable to dispel than the rest of our cards are, but if they're dispelling a Silverguard Knight, that's not the worst thing ever. They spent a card on it, and you only spent 3 mana on your Knight, so and finally, I wanted to do something a little different than Primus Shieldmaster for the mid-game, so I put in 2 copies of Suntide Maiden. So I've gained a lot of respect for this card recently. It's surprisingly powerful. What it does is at the end of your turn, mind, not theirs, if it's next to Argeon, it heals back up to a 3/6, which means that it can just chew through smaller units all day. And it gets better than that because if you roar on it, now it's a 5/6 that then heals up. So you can make really favourable attacks with it. You know, you can get in for damage against an opposing general with an equipment on, you can eat 4 drops, you can do all sorts of nasty things. And then it just goes right back up to being a 3/6, and your opponent has to put full effort into killing it. It's a really solid card, and I've played with and against it a few times recently and just been roundly impressed. So I chose to put a couple of those in instead of the usual Primus Shieldmaster. If you don't have Suntide Maidens, Primus Shieldmaster is absolutely fine. If you're running into a lot of very aggressive decks, you probably also want the Shieldmaster because the provoke is just useful for protecting yourself and helping you maintain or gain tempo against a very aggressive opponent. But against, you know, just as a way to chow through their 2-drops, or, you know, mow up tokens and things like that, Suntide Maiden's fantastic. Next up, Sojourner. Sojourner gets a category all of her own. As I went through in last week's video, there are not that many options for drawing cards in Duelist, and a lot of them are a bit expensive and or limited. Sojourner is a really good all-rounder. Her main weaknesses are being dispelled, which is very sad, Zenry, which is heartbreaking, and her kind of small body. And Argeon can deal with all of that because of Roar. So if you play a Sojourner and Roar it, it's a 3/5. It can't be stolen by Zenry, and your opponent will have to actually take relevant damage when they try and kill it, if they decide to go down that route. If it gets dispelled, you can make it into a 3/5, rendering it much less useless. So you may have, you know, they've used a dispel and you've still got a 3/5 body. That's worth, you know, that's worth the card. That's good. So we definitely want 3 Sojourners. So Sojourner is also a rare. It's this deck's other rare. So this is a slightly more expensive deck than the one I built last week. But it is my firm belief that if you're going to craft anything in this game, it should be A, Primus Fist, B, Dancing Blades, and C, Sojourner. I think, you know, the first time you open a sort of mediocre legendary that you're not really planning on playing, just turn it into 3 Sojourners. You know, you won't regret it. They're amazing. Card draw is very important in this game. And, you know, especially since recently they changed Xeric's Starstrider's Bloodborne spell. If you weren't playing at the time, it used to spawn a 2/2 with Rush that died at the end of the turn, like the ones that come out with the obelisks. So that was really powerful and made the meta quite aggressive. Since that was banned, there aren't really that many super aggressive decks, so it's slowed down a bit. So drawing cards is really important now. And it's nice to have at least 3, you know, solid card drawing creatures in your deck. So Sojourner is just MVP of choice and is much easier to get hold of and easier to use than the others. So I highly recommend crafting a bunch of Sojourners as soon as you're able. Or, you know, opening them. You can always just get lucky. Right, so we've got 9 slots left, and we've just got a ton of pretty good minions and some Divine Bonds. So we're going to need to flesh out with some removal and some interaction. This is the, you know, these are the spells and the small things with opening Gambit rather than the giant piles of stats that make up most of our deck. And it's useful to just have things that you can't deal with a giant minion. Sometimes things are far away, or have too many abilities, or maybe they're things like minions with Death Strike seal on them, where they will kill your minion if it attacks, regardless of how big yours is. So one thing I decided to try in this deck is Sunstone Braces. So you'll recognize this as the first equipment. It's in a few of the challenges. It's in the starter deck, and it's sort of like not a massively impactful card, but it does cost no mana, and it makes your general 3 attack, which is really valuable. Having played against Varth and his Bloodborne spell, which makes him 3 attack on turn 3 quite a lot recently, I've realized the value of just being able to eat 2/3 with your general. And so one really good way of gaining tempo very early in the game would be to equip a Sunstone Braces and just eat their 2-drop. And then your other minion, if you've played one, or if you have one out, is free to move. All your mana is still free to play another minion. And so this is exactly the destroy your minion, play my minion kind of tempo swing that I talked about earlier when I was introducing the concept. Obviously that's a pretty narrow application. It's only good in the first turn or so, and you really don't want to draw a lot of these. So I'm just going to include one. And it'll come up sometimes and be really spicy, and your opponent will be like, what? Am I really getting wrecked by Sunstone Braces? What is this nonsense? The next thing to put in is Blood Tier Alchemist. You might recognize this card from before. So Blood Tier Alchemist is really good. It's just a little utility minion that can ping off Jaxi tokens, artifacts, pyromancers, all sorts of nasty stuff that is usually small but far away and with lots of relevant text. So we're going to put in a couple of these. Next, it's pretty hard to go into a game of Duelist without any dispel at all. We're generally relying on the size of our minions to kind of render the opponent's minions text irrelevant, but we are going to need to actually render it irrelevant some of the time. So here's a couple of ephemeral shrouds. Next up is the AoE spell I mentioned earlier, Tempest. This is another basic. I really like this card. I find it to be very useful. It's surprisingly good at just dealing 2 to their face when you're slightly off lethal, as among other things. You can use it to attack a 2/3 with Argeon and finish it off with Tempest if you have to. You can use it to apply a bit of pressure. You can obviously use it to clear off swarms of wraithlings. That's its main usage. It does all sorts of things. The card is generally pretty. It's a little bit situational, especially as it's symmetrical, but it's pretty powerful. So we'll put 2 of those in. And finally, Martyrdom. This card, in my opinion, doesn't see enough play. It is a little bit expensive for what it does, because oftentimes you end up kind of priced into just using it on a 2/3 with ranged or something, and it feels a bit, it's a bit unsatisfying using your hard removal spell on some random dork just because you don't have a better way of getting rid of it. So Lion decks with more removal can generally avoid that, because they might have Lasting Judgment or Holy Immolation, all these other removal spells that will kill smaller things more efficiently than Martyrdom does. We don't have any of that stuff. We just need to occasionally be able to get rid of a large provoke or some bomb on their side. Maybe they have a golem, who knows, who might run into the mirror. It's pretty unlikely in Diamond, but it can happen. And certainly if you're new, you're probably a bit lower on the ladder than I am at the moment, because I've been playing every day this month. And Martyrdom is really good just as a catch-all for, oh wow, they have a legendary, boop, oh wow, they have a 10/10, boop. It just, it's great. So we're going to put in 2 Martyrdoms, and that's the deck. So to recap, we have a deck of mostly minions, more so than most other decks, because we just want to get a bunch of good stats onto the board and overwhelm our opponent with aggression, tempo plays, and high amounts of damage. We've got really good early 2-drops, supplemented by our interactive early minions as well, which are quite good. We've got Sunstone Braces to get them when they play 2/3s. We have arguably the best 3-drop in the game, Silver God Knight, except maybe Lantern Fox, who's a bit broken. We have the ever lovely Sojourner to draw cards, which is obviously fantastic with Argeon's Bloodborne spell. Kind of removes all its weaknesses. And then, as our top end and the sort of bulk of our game plan, we have I guess that's kind of appropriate. We have these giant heaps of stats that are the golems, and our plan is to get them out, crunch through the enemy's defenses, and bash them in the face for unholy amounts of damage. And if we can do that, because of the size of essentially all of our minions, it's going to be hard for the opponent to trade into them efficiently with their minions or with their damage spells. Things like Windblade Adept, that's 4 damage. You don't really want to attack that with your general if you can help it, and it deals a lot of damage to a 3 or 4 drop, or eats an opposing 2 drop without dying. It becomes a 4/1 when it hits a 2/3. So, and that goes right on up to these huge, uncontestedly large minions that we have at the top end. So that's that. This is I struggled for a while to think of a name for this deck, but I eventually called it Robot Wars, because, well, obviously, if you've never seen Robot Wars, it's a TV show where contestants build robots and then fight them in this giant arena. And I think it last aired about 10 years ago, but it's coming back this month. I'm so hyped. It's going to be amazing. And until then, we're going to enact it by casting Divine Bond on a Storm Metal Golem and decking them for 16 or 18 damage. Just like the way Counterplay intended it. So, I'm going to end the video here. I'm going to break it in half for my convenience, for your convenience, and for the sake of my voice. And then in the second half, in the other part of the video, I will jump on the ladder. I'm currently rank 4. I've currently won 2 games with this deck at rank 4. We'll see if I can do that again. I'll go through a couple of demonstration games and we'll see how the tempo game plan plays out, and I'll try and throw in what advice I have about positioning and knowing your opponent's game plan as we go. So, thank you very much for listening. I'll see you on the other side.